I smelled it before I saw anything. That's the part nobody believes, or the part they skip over when they retell it, because it doesn't fit the version of events that makes the story easier to process. They want to hear about the running, the barricades, the decisions made under fire. They don't want to hear about a smell drifting upslope through pine trees on an ordinary Tuesday morning in late October while I was repairing a washed-out section of the High Sierra Trail corridor, 3 miles above the nearest paved road, with a Pulaski axe in my hands and sweat cooling on the back of my neck. The wind comes from the valley in the mornings. You learn that after enough seasons on a trail crew. You learn to read the air the way you read the soil, what it tells you about moisture, about fire risk, about whether the day is going to close early on you. I had been reading that air for 3 years. I knew the smell of a deer carcass at 100 yards. I knew the particular sweetness of a spring bloom mixing with snow melt. I knew what a campfire smelled like at a mile and what a controlled burn smelled like at 5. What I smelled that morning at roughly 7:40 a.m. was none of those things. It was biological and enormous. Not a carcass. A carcass is localized, specific, contained to a radius. This was a horizontal wall of it moving up slope like weather. It smelled like a slaughterhouse left in a warm room for too long, mixed with something I couldn't categorize as something chemical beneath the organic layer, like the body had begun processing itself in a way bodies weren't designed to process. I pulled my bandana up without deciding to. The reflex preceded the thought. My trail partner that morning was Joel Marsh, 26, 1 season senior to me on the crew. A man who expressed disapproval through silence and everything else through sarcasm. He had stopped raking the drainage berm 6 feet from me, and he was standing completely still with his head tilted slightly downhill, which was Joel's version of alarm. "You getting that?" I asked. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, "Define that." "The smell." "Yeah," he said. "I'm getting that." We stood there for about 30 seconds doing nothing, which was the first correct decision either of us made that morning. Not panicking, not theorizing, just absorbing data before assigning it a frame. The smell didn't intensify or diminish. It held at a steady pressure, which meant the source wasn't approaching, but the source was large enough to create a sustained atmospheric signature at this elevation. I had my radio on my left hip. Crew channel, not emergency band. I clicked the call button twice and waited. Marcus, our crew lead, was working a drainage crew 2 ridges over. He should have responded in under a minute. He didn't respond. I clicked again. Nothing. Joel had put down his rake. He was looking at me with the particular expression he wore when he was waiting for someone else to say the thing he'd already concluded. Was not a reassuring expression. "When did you last hear from Marcus?" he asked. 40 minutes ago. Check-in at 7. "What did he say?" "Drainage clear. Moving south toward the fork." Joel looked downhill. Not at anything specific. At the direction. "I haven't been able to raise Carrie either. I tried 10 minutes ago." Carrie was the 4th member of our rotation, working the eastern spur. Figured radio interference. There's a rock face between us. There is always a logical first explanation. That's not stupidity. That's how functional people operate. They exhaust the ordinary before they accept the extraordinary. But the logical explanation for the smell ran out before the smell did. And the silence on the radio was the second data point. And the way the tree line below us had gone completely still, no bird song, no wind movement in the canopy, just a vertical wall of silence sitting at the edge of hearing, was the third. I picked up my Pulaski. "We should go higher," I said. "Yeah," Joel said. He was already moving. We didn't run at first. Running in trail terrain above 6,000 feet with tools in your hands is how you blow an ankle and end your options in a single step. And I was conscious of that, in the specific mechanical way you become conscious of things when your mind is trying very hard to stay useful. We moved fast, faster than work pace, slower than panic, and I kept the radio in my left hand clicking every 90 seconds on both crew and emergency channels. The ridge we were angling toward was the eastern spine of the basin, a granite shelf at roughly 7,200 feet where the crew had cached equipment at the start of the season. There was a water source there, a spring-fed seep that ran reliable until December, and the terrain gave you a natural view corridor down into the valley for about 4 miles. I wasn't thinking about the cache. I was thinking about elevation and sightline, about getting high enough to see what was producing that smell before it reached us. We heard them before we reached the ridge. I want to be accurate here because accuracy is the only thing I have left to offer. What we heard was not what the movies trained you to expect. There was no moaning, no collective groan, no dramatic audio signature announcing the arrival of a threat. What we heard was footsteps, plural, irregular, the specific unrhythmic percussion of multiple bodies moving through brush without any coordination or trail awareness. Branches snapping at the wrong intervals, weight distribution wrong. And underneath that, a sound I initially misidentified as wind in dry grass, which turned out, when we stopped moving to listen, to be the sound of continuous exhalation, breath pushed out in a shallow, rapid cycle, over and over, from multiple sources, without the corresponding sound of inhalation. Joel grabbed my arm. He pulled me sideways off the trail without speaking, into a thicket of manzanita that scraped both of us badly. And we went flat against the uphill side of a granite outcrop. He was close enough that I could see his throat move when he swallowed. 3 of them came up the trail. I had been on that trail section twice a day for 6 weeks. I knew the hiker profile: boots, poles, backpacks, the particular purposeful forward lean of people moving under weight with an objective. These 3 people had none of that. They were moving uphill with the same mindless mechanical persistence as water finding a path. Following the trail, not because they understood it as a trail, but because it was the path of least resistance through the terrain. Their clothes were wrong. One of them was a man in what had been a dress shirt, open at the collar, one sleeve missing. The second was a woman I couldn't look at for long. The third was wearing a high-visibility vest, and I made myself register that detail, because it meant infrastructure, a road worker or utility crew, which meant the valley had already been processing this for long enough to reach working adults at job sites. They passed 12 feet from us. Joel's hand was on my forearm, and I could feel the individual pressure of each finger. And I focused on that sensation deliberately because it was specific and present, and it kept the part of my mind that wanted to make noise completely occupied. When they were gone, not far gone, just out of immediate visual range, still audible, Joel released my arm and put his mouth close to my ear. 3, he said. I counted 3. There are more behind them. Listen. He was right. The irregular snapping in the brush below us was not diminishing. It was spreading laterally, which meant the movement wasn't a column, but a dispersal, things fanning out upslope through the forest, because there was no longer anything downslope requiring their attention. The valley had already been processed. Whatever had happened down there was finished, and now the remainder was expanding outward along the natural gradient. Upward. Toward us. We made the ridge in 11 minutes at a pace that cost Joel a twisted left knee he didn't mention for another 4 days and cost me a gash along my right forearm from a branch I misjudged in the last scramble. From the granite shelf, we could see the valley. I won't describe what we saw in detail. I'll say only that the scale of it was the thing that mattered, the way the event had covered the horizontal terrain completely and irreversibly. The way smoke was rising from at least 7 separate points. The way the road that fed the trailhead parking area was fully occupied by stopped vehicles, some at angles that indicated they had never been parked but simply ceased moving. The valley was not mid-event. The valley was post-event. This had already concluded down there. We were watching the aftermath from above, the way you watch a flood plain from a ridge after the water has receded, except the water hadn't receded. It was still moving, just not in any direction water moves. Joel sat down on the granite shelf and put his hands on his knees. "Marcus isn't coming," he said. "No," I said. "Carrie either." I didn't answer that. I was looking at the tree canopy below us, the elevation band between 6,000 and 6,500 feet, and watching the irregular movement in it. The dispersal was slower up here. The terrain was harder. But it was methodical, in the way only gravity is methodical. The way only a force that doesn't tire or recalculate is methodical. And it was going to reach this elevation given sufficient time, regardless of what we did or didn't do. "How much food do you have?" I asked. Joel looked at his pack. "Day's ration. Maybe a day and a half if I'm careful." "Water?" 2 liters. I had roughly the same. I also had a folding saw, a full toolkit, emergency tarp, cord, and a fire kit. Joel had a similar kit minus the saw. Between us, we had the material foundation of something, which was the first useful thought I'd had since the smell. "We need to go higher," I said. "How high?" I looked up the ridge. Above the granite shelf, the terrain broke into a mixed conifer zone that gave way to a boulder field, and then to a secondary ridge at roughly 8,000 feet. I had scouted that area once, 2 seasons back, during a fire assessment. There was a flat shelf up there, a natural terrace cut into the hillside by old erosion that was wide enough to work on, sheltered on 3 sides by the ridge itself, and visible from below only if you knew exactly where to look. I hadn't thought about it in 2 years. I was thinking about it now, with the particular intensity of a mind that has just recognized that information it stored without purpose has suddenly become the most important thing it possesses. "High enough that the grade becomes the barrier," I said. "Come on. I want to explain something about the Pulaski axe, because it matters for everything that follows. It's a trail tool. A 2-sided head that combines a standard cutting blade on one face with a horizontal adze blade on the other, designed specifically for cutting through root systems and breaking compacted earth. Trail crews use them for drainage construction, erosion repair, clearing debris after blowdown events. You spend a season with a Pulaski, and the feel of it becomes automatic, the specific weight distribution, the way the head wants to rotate through a swing, the difference in resistance between rootwood and soil and rock. It's not a weapon. It was never designed as a weapon. But it is an axe, and it is heavy. And when I tell you it was the first thing I reached for when movement appeared in the brush at my 9 o'clock position on the second day, I want you to understand, I wasn't reaching for a weapon. I was reaching for the only tool I trusted completely, which is a different thing. That second morning on the upper ridge was the morning I started building. Joel had spent the first night in bad shape. The knee had swollen through the night, and he'd slept poorly against the rock. And when he woke up, he was running the particular kind of quiet that people run when they're trying to assess their own damage without admitting it to anyone. I let him run it. I made a fire small enough to produce minimal smoke, heated water from the seep, made him drink twice as much as he thought he needed, and then I started walking the terrace. The sight was better than I remembered. The natural shelf was approximately 40 feet wide and 22 feet deep, backed by a near vertical rock face on its uphill side that created a natural windbreak and limited approach to a single direction. The exposure was east-facing, which meant morning sun and afternoon shade workable in late October, meaningful in terms of thermal management. 2 mature red firs at the shelf's eastern edge were positioned in a way that wasn't useful for a traditional frame build, but was ideal for a cantilevered platform structure, the kind of elevated build that trail crews sometimes construct for equipment cache stations in high-use areas. I had done one of those builds before, under supervision, in my second season. I had not forgotten it. I told Joel what I was thinking. He listened with his back against the rock face and his injured leg extended, and when I finished, he asked the question I expected. How long? If I can source enough timber from deadfall in the immediate area, the platform frame takes 3 days. Walls take another 3 if I'm going light a lean-to configuration against the rock face, not a freestanding structure. Roof takes 1 more day if conditions hold. 7 days minimum. Realistic estimate, yes. And you can do this. It wasn't quite a question. It was Joel processing whether to invest belief in what I was describing, which was a reasonable thing to take time over. I had built the equipment cache station under supervision. I had watched the lead carpenter on that build work out every joint and load calculation in real time, talking through his decisions. And I had retained more of it than I'd realized, because retention happens at the hands, not at the memory. You learn a physical process by doing it, and what you learn gets stored somewhere in the body that survives the mind, forgetting the details. I think I can do this, I said. That's the honest answer. Joel nodded once. Okay, what do I do? You process material. Stay on this terrace. Use the folding saw on that deadfall cluster at the north end. I need lengths between 6 and 10 feet. As consistent a diameter as possible. Stack them in the order you cut them. Don't move around more than you have to. Because of the knee. Because of the knee. He looked at the downslope. The forest below was quiet in the way it had been quiet since we arrived. A structural silence that you felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. You think they can get up here? He asked. The gradient between 6,500 and 7,200 is about 35% in sections. That's hard terrain, even with full function. I paused. But I don't want to rely on the gradient alone. That's why we're building up. The first true beam cut took me 40 minutes on a red fir snag I'd identified as structurally sound dead, long enough to be dry, not so long as to have begun decomposing. I cut to a 10-foot length, dragged it to the fir anchor trees, and spent another 20 minutes on the mortise joint that would seat the beam into the first anchor notch I'd cut into the living tree. The cut was imperfect. I recut it twice. The third version held under test load, and I moved on. This is what I want to convey about those first days of building, because it's the emotional core of something that took me a long time to understand. The work was the only thing that kept the valley from occupying my full attention. As long as I was solving a structural problem, load path, joint integrity, material selection, the scale of what I'd seen from the granite shelf was contained to the periphery. Not forgotten, contained. The work gave my mind a legitimate object at human scale, which was the only scale the mind can actually process without fracturing. Joel understood this without my saying it. By the second afternoon, his timber processing had developed a rhythm that was quieter than productivity required. And I recognized in that rhythm the same management strategy, the deliberate narrowing of attention to a physical task that produced visible, measurable progress. Because visible and measurable progress is the only available argument against the part of your brain that keeps replaying the view from the granite shelf. We didn't talk about Marcus. We didn't talk about Carrie. We worked until the light failed, and then we stopped. On the fourth day, I found evidence that we were not the first people to have considered this elevation a refuge. It was tucked into a crack in the rock face at the back of the terrace, a small dry bag, the kind used for kayaking, sealed with a roll-top closure. Inside, a folded USGS topographic map of the basin, a small signal mirror, a half-used roll of surveying tape, and a waterproof notepad containing 8 pages of handwritten notes in a cramped, left-leaning script I didn't recognize. I read the notes twice before I told Joel about them. The person who had written them had been a fire lookout technician named Daria Osei, based on the initials and the station identifier written at the top of the first page. She had been doing routine equipment maintenance on the upper ridge in the weeks before the outbreak, and had apparently visited this terrace as part of her survey work. The notes were a mix of terrain observations, equipment inventory records, and in the final 3 pages, something that had shifted in register from professional notation to personal record. Short sentences, compressed handwriting, dates that placed the final entries at roughly 10 days before Joel and I had reached the ridge. The last entry read, "Signal mirror no use. No aircraft responding. Basin fully compromised. Going down to check Ridgeline Station. If anyone reads this, the terrace is sound. The east firs are anchors. Stay above 7,200 DO." She had gone down to check the lookout station. She had not come back to retrieve the bag. I sat with that for a long time before I folded the map and put it in my own pack. The signal mirror I kept out. The surveying tape I gave to Joel for material marking. The notepad I kept sealed in the dry bag and stored in the crack where I'd found it, which felt like the right thing to do without being a thing I could fully explain. "She was here first," Joel said. He'd read the notes after me. "Yes." "And she went down." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, turning the roll of surveying tape over in his hands. "Do you think she made it?" I thought about the valley from the granite shelf. I thought about the high visibility vest. "I don't know," I said. Because I didn't. That was the accurate answer, and it was the only one I was willing to give. What the notes changed, practically, was the map. The USGS topographic showed the basin in a resolution I hadn't had access to before, and in the upper right quadrant, marked with a small penciled circle in what I assumed was Daria's hand, was a secondary trailhead access point at the northern end of the ridge, a fire road that dead-ended at an equipment staging area at roughly 8,000 feet. If that staging area was intact, it potentially held cached materials, hand tools, possibly fuel, possibly emergency rations in a fire cache box. It was 2 miles north along the ridgeline, 2 miles of exposed terrain. I didn't tell Joel about the fire road immediately, not because I was hiding it, I told him the next morning, but because I needed to calculate whether the potential gain was worth the exposure before I offered it as an option. Because offering options you haven't evaluated is just distributing anxiety. Joel's knee was improving but was not yet trustworthy on uneven terrain. The fire road was not something we could investigate together without accepting a level of risk that the current build didn't yet require. By the end of day 4, the platform frame was complete 2 anchor beams set in the firs, 3 cross beams mortised and pegged, a decking layer of split timber lengths that gave us a raised floor approximately 8 by 12 feet at an elevation of roughly 6 feet above the terrace surface. It was not beautiful. It was not precise in the way that a carpenter would recognize as precise. But it was load-bearing, and it was stable. And when I stood on it for the first time and bounced my weight deliberately on the center span, nothing moved that should not have moved. Joel looked up at it from the terrace floor. Something in his face shifted, not quite relief, not quite pride, but the specific expression of a person watching a theoretical become actual and discovering that the actual is real enough to trust. "It holds," I said. "Yeah," he said, "it holds." That evening, for the first time since the valley, I let myself think about what came after the build, not the next day's tasks, but the shape of what we were constructing toward. Not escape. Escape required knowing where to escape to. And the map gave me no information about what lay beyond the basin that would constitute an improvement over what we were building. What we were constructing toward was duration. The capacity to remain viable at this elevation long enough for the situation below to change in a direction that made descent survivable. That was the frame I needed to hold. Not rescue, not reunion. Duration. I had nobody waiting for me in the valley. My parents were in Portland, which was either fine or not fine, and either way was not something I could affect from here. I had no one whose absence was a constant pull downward. That was either my advantage or the thing that would eventually hollow me out. And in those early days, I hadn't yet determined which. Joel had a sister in Reno. He didn't talk about her directly, but I could tell from the way he looked at the southern horizon, sometimes, particularly in the evenings, that the calculation was running continuously in the background. The probability assessment that he wouldn't articulate because articulation would require him to assign numbers to outcomes he wasn't ready to face. I let him keep that private. It was his, not mine to manage. On day 7, I made the walk to the fire road. I went alone at first light, leaving Joel with explicit instructions and the Pulaski within reach of his position. I moved along the ridgeline at a pace that kept me in tree cover as much as possible, checking the slope below at each gap in the canopy. The dispersal had slowed. I was seeing movement in the forest below in the 6,500 to 6,800-foot band, which suggested the terrain gradient was doing some of the work I'd hoped it would do. But the presence was consistent, and the direction of drift was still upward. Slowly, but upward. The fire road staging area was intact. I stood at the edge of it for a full minute before entering, scanning every visible approach. And then I moved fast through the space, with a systematic efficiency I hadn't known I possessed until that moment. The cash box was a green metal chest, padlocked, mounted on a concrete pad behind a small equipment shed. I broke the lock with a rock, not a difficult operation on a padlock that had been weathering for several seasons, and found inside 12 emergency ration bars, a 2-liter insulated water bladder, a sealed medical kit, a pair of leather work gloves, and large 2 coils of nylon rope rated to 800 pounds, and a hand-lettered laminated card listing the contents and the resupply protocol. I stood in the staging area with 2 coils of rope in my hands and felt something I can only describe as the specific gratitude of receiving exactly what you needed before you knew you needed it, which is different from luck and different from relief, and is in fact closer to the feeling of a sentence completing itself. I also found, leaning against the inner wall of the equipment shed, a chainsaw. No fuel, but a chainsaw in good condition with a full chain, which was a tool that would have cut my construction timeline by 30% if I'd had it a week earlier, and was now relevant to the wall phase in a way that made the 2-mile walk more than worthwhile. The walk back was harder. I was carrying 60 additional pounds over terrain that wanted to turn my ankles on every 3rd step, and I was doing it fast enough that I had no margin for the careful foot placement the terrain required. So I was accepting small risks on each footfall and banking on the aggregate holding. It held. I reached the terrace at mid-morning, and Joel looked at the ropes and the cash box and the chainsaw, and his expression said everything he didn't say out loud. Daria marked this on the map, I told him. She knew what she was doing, he said. She knew what she was doing, I agreed. The walls went up faster than I'd projected 3 days, rather than the estimated 3, because the rope allowed me to manage heavy material with mechanical advantage in ways the earlier phase had required pure labor. And because the rock face gave me a ready-made third wall that needed only chinking and weatherproofing, rather than construction. I built the lean-to configuration I'd originally planned. 2 framed timber walls on the north and south faces, meeting the rock wall at the back, angling inward at the top to create a pitched roof slope that would shed the snowpack that would come in the next 4 to 6 weeks if the season ran typical. The roof was the most technically demanding part. I had no metal sheeting, no proper waterproofing membrane. What I had was tarpaulin, mine, and Joel's combined emergency tarps, plus 2 additional tarps I found folded in the equipment shed. And I had enough split timber for a dense batten layer beneath the tarp to distribute load and prevent pooling. I layered the tarps in overlapping horizontal courses, weighted the edges with rocks, and drove pegs through the grommets where the pitch allowed access. It was not a permanent roof. It was a roof that would function through 1 winter if maintained, which was all I needed it to be. On the evening of day 10, it rained. We were inside the cabin. It was a cabin now, definitively. Not a structure or a shelter or a build, but a cabin. A word that carries weight in the mouth when you first apply it to something you've made with your hands, and the rain hit the tarp roof and ran down the pitch in the exact direction it was designed to run. And the interior stayed dry. And Joel laughed. A short, involuntary sound. The kind of laugh that escapes before the person decides to allow it. It was the first time either of us had laughed since the valley, and it lasted about 3 seconds, and then it was gone, and neither of us acknowledged it. But it happened, and that mattered. "You actually built it," he said. "We built it. I processed timber. That's building?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the rain pattern on the tarp. "What's the plan now?" he asked. Genuinely, what's the plan? I had been thinking about this question since day 4, and the way you think about a problem that won't resolve until more information arrives. "Duration," I said. "We need to know 3 things. What the situation is at the basin perimeter, whether there's organized response anywhere in the region, and whether the fire road is accessible by vehicle from the northern end. And if there's organized response? Then we have a destination. Then descent becomes a calculation instead of a guess. And if there isn't?" I looked at the cabin walls, at the joint work, the pegged beams, the chinking between timber lengths that had taken me an entire afternoon to work out to a standard that would hold against wind. "Then we're already somewhere," I said. 3 days after the roof was finished, someone found the terrace. I heard her before I saw her a specific kind of breathing that was labored in the way exhaustion is labored. With the controlled desperation of a person who has been moving hard for too long and is now moving on, will alone. Joel was on the platform running an inventory count of our food supplies. I was at the south wall cutting a window frame opening. I decided a single small window on the downslope face was worth a structural compromise for the light and sight line it provided, and the sound came from the approach slope to the east, from the boulder field between the terrace and the secondary ridge above. She came through the boulders at a near crawl, using both hands on the rock, and stopped at the edge of the terrace with both hands on her knees, breathing in a way that made me hold still for a long second to assess whether she was infected before I let myself read anything else about her. She wasn't. The infected didn't breathe like that. The shallow, rapid cycle we'd heard on the trail had nothing in common with the deep, desperate pull of a person whose body was demanding oxygen after sustained exertion. This was a person who had been running for a long time from something, and had stopped running, and her lungs were now filing an urgent complaint about the preceding hours. She was maybe 30, compact build, dressed in layers that had been practical at some earlier point, and were now torn in multiple places. A headlamp strapped to her forehead, switched off. A pack that had been good quality once and had clearly been through several kinds of hell since. She looked up at the cabin first, at the platform, the walls, the roof. Then she looked at me. "You built that," she said. Not a question. "Working on it," I said. "How long have you been up here?" 12 days. Something moved across her face, a rapid calculation. Relief, hitting disbelief, hitting some kind of grief. All in under 2 seconds. "I've been trying to reach this elevation for 6 days, she said. Her name was Petra Voss. She had been a Park Service law enforcement ranger at the Basin District Office, and she had been in the valley when it happened, had in fact been part of the initial response coordination before the initial response coordination had collapsed completely. She had more information about the outbreak's progression than either Joel or I, which was both useful and difficult to absorb. I let her drink and eat before I asked for the information. Joel climbed down from the platform and sat across from her, and we listened while she talked. The basin had been fully compromised within 48 hours. The outbreak's vector was still unclear to her. She hadn't had access to the final communication from County Emergency Management before the channels went dark, and what she'd observed on the ground was consistent with multiple transmission pathways rather than a single point of origin, which she described as making organized containment essentially impossible from the first day. She had spent 4 days in a locked ranger station at the southern edge of the basin before concluding that the station was not sustainable and that her only viable option was the elevation. She had passed through the 6,500-foot band 2 days before we arrived and had been moving in the upper tree line since, avoiding the dispersed infected with a combination of terrain knowledge and what she described, without effect as luck. When she finished, she looked at the cabin again. "How long will it hold?" she asked. "1 winter, maintained," I said. "Longer if we add to it." She said. I held her gaze. That's what I said. Her expression was not relief. It was more complicated than relief. It was the expression of a person who has been surviving in a fundamentally solitary mode for long enough that the offer of plurality carries a kind of weight she wasn't prepared for. She looked at Joel, who shrugged in the particular way that meant he'd already run the calculation and was fine with the outcome. "I have supplies," she said. "In my pack. I have information about this terrain. I know where the fire road connects on the northern end." "We found the staging area," I said. "I know a better route to it. 40 minutes shorter, stays in cover the whole way." Joel looked at me. I looked at Petra. "You're here," I said. "The cabin has 3 sleeping positions. That's not a coincidence." She didn't answer that for a moment. Then she put down her water and picked up the window frame piece I'd been cutting and turned it over in her hands, examining the joint work with the particular attention of a person assessing structural quality. She handed it back to me without comment, which I read as approval. And then she opened her pack and began laying out her supplies on the terrace floor in a systematic way that told me she was already thinking in terms of shared inventory. That was the decision. It was never spoken as a decision. It just resolved itself in the actions that followed, the way real decisions usually do. I need to tell you about the person I turned away. On day 14, 2 days after Petra arrived, a man appeared at the approach slope. He was alone, moving carefully, and he stopped at the edge of the terrace with his hands visible in the way a person holds their hands when they've learned the hard way that visible hands communicate intent. He was older than me by 15 to 20 years. Lean in the specific way that people become lean when calories have been restricted for long enough. Wearing a jacket that had once been insulated and was now primarily functional as a layer. His name was Jeff Rayner. He'd been a high school science teacher at the Basin District School. He had reached the upper elevation alone. No group, no guidance. Just the same instinct Joel and I had followed, and he had been subsisting for 11 days on whatever he could scavenge from an emergency supply kit he'd found in an abandoned vehicle on the fire road. He looked at the cabin the way everyone who arrived at this terrace looked at the cabin, with an expression that moved from disbelief to something more complicated than relief. And then he looked at the three of us, and something in that arithmetic was clearly doing something difficult to him in real time. "I'm not asking to stay," he said, before any of us spoke. "I'm asking for whatever you can spare. Food, water, I'll move on." I looked at Petra. Petra was looking at Jeff with the calculating attention she brought to everything she assessed, reading him with the practiced speed of someone trained to evaluate threat. Joel was watching me. The cabin had 3 sleeping positions. We were using all 3. Our food inventory, combined, ran to approximately 22 days at current consumption rates if we made no additional acquisitions. Adding a 4th body brought that to 16 days. And 16 days in late October at this elevation, before any successful resupply, was a margin I had not planned for. Those were the numbers. I had run them before he arrived, not as a prophylactic against exactly this scenario, but as general resource management. But running them as abstract arithmetic and applying them to a specific person standing in front of you asking for food with his hands held open. Those are not the same operation. They use different parts of you. "There's room," Joel said. I looked at him. He was looking at Jeff. "Joel," I said, "I'm just saying there's room. The platform is 12 by 8. That's not 3 sleeping positions. That's 4 if people aren't precious about space." He looked at me with the expression he used when he'd already decided something and was giving me the courtesy of arriving at the same conclusion independently. "He's standing right there." Petra said nothing. She was still reading Jeff, running her own assessment. "Your supplies?" she asked him. He told her what he had. It was modest, an inventory that extended our collective margin by perhaps 3 days rather than reducing it. Petra processed this with visible neutrality. I told Jeff to give us a few minutes. He nodded and stepped back to the boulder field without question, which told me something about how many doors he had already been on the other side of, and how he'd learned to wait without pressing. The 3 of us spoke in low voices. I laid out the resource calculation. Petra agreed the numbers were tight. Joel said the numbers were always going to be tight, and what mattered was whether the margin was survivable with 4 people working toward the same objectives versus 3 people working with the particular psychological weight of having turned a person away. I didn't have a response to that. Not because it was unanswerable, but because it was accurate. We called Jeff back. What I didn't anticipate, what none of us anticipated, was how much Jeff Rayner would change the nature of what we were building. Not the structure. The structure was already determined by the time he arrived. What changed was the intellectual architecture of the place, the way we understood what we were doing and why. He was a biology teacher, and his specific area within biology was ecology. And within ecology, his passion had always been, as he put it, in the particular self-deprecating register of people who feel their enthusiasms are disproportionate. The boring part, nutrient cycling, soil chemistry, the mechanics of how energy moves through a system over time. On day 15, He walked the terrace perimeter and identified a south-facing soil patch, where the aspect and drainage were sufficient for a cold-season planting. He produced from his pack a small, sealed envelope of mixed cold, hardy seed kale, winter radish, a variety of spinach that he'd carried from his classroom supply cabinet because, he said, I took everything useful I could reach in 90 seconds, and seed packets seemed like the right category of useful. He spent 2 hours on that soil patch. By the end of it, he had a 2-by-4-foot bed, turned and amended with composted bark. From a deadfall pile I'd been treating as pure construction material, and planted with every seed in the envelope and covered with a layer of dead leaves held down with small stones. I watched him work with a feeling I hadn't experienced since the build began, the particular feeling of watching someone apply expertise. You don't have to a problem you didn't know existed. The garden bed wouldn't produce anything for 3 to 4 weeks, and what it produced would be modest, and it would require consistent water. But it was a system. It was a thing that would generate return if maintained, which was a different category of asset from everything else we had, which would only deplete. You've been carrying seeds for 11 days, Petra said. I'm a biology teacher, Jeff said, as if that fully explained it. It does, Joel said, which confused Petra until she realized Joel had responded to what Jeff had meant rather than what he'd said. Those small moments of group coherence, the way 4 people who had come to the same ledge by different routes started to develop the shorthand of shared context, were the things I was least prepared for. I had been thinking in terms of individual resource units, overlapping schedules, distributed workloads. I had not been thinking in terms of the emergence of something that felt, against all reasonable probability, like a household. But that's what it was becoming. Not a camp, not a refuge. A household. 4 people with separate histories and different skill sets and different loss inventories. Developing the specific informal grammar of people who have decided, at a practical level, to function as a unit. That process had a cost I wasn't aware of yet. It would become apparent later. On day 17, the infected reached 7,100 feet. I saw the first one from the window I'd cut into the south wall, a single figure moving through the uppermost tree line at the edge of the terrace's sight line, moving in the same directionless gradient-following way I'd observed on the first day. Alone, as far as I could tell. But alone meant the dispersal front had advanced 400 feet in elevation since our arrival. And the rate implied the gradient was no longer the barrier I'd calculated it to be. I called the others to the window without raising my voice. We watched it for several minutes. It was moving east to west along the contour, not directly uphill following the path of least resistance, through the specific terrain rather than ascending by the shortest route. That was actually important information. The infected were not purposefully seeking elevation. They were following topographic ease, which meant the ridge faces with higher gradient would continue to deflect rather than channel. What would funnel them upward was not intent, but accumulated drift, the slow filling of the lower elevations, pushing the density upward simply because the lower elevations were running out of space. Timeline? Petra asked. I had estimated 60 days, I said. That estimate was based on the gradient holding more effectively than it apparently is. Revised estimate, maybe 30 to 40 days before consistent presence at this elevation. And we need to be gone before that. We need to be gone before that, or we need a defensive capability we currently don't have. Define defensive capability, Joel said. Controlled access, single entry point, something we can hold against a low-volume approach. Petra was quiet. She was looking at the cabin structure at the platform, the single approach slope, the boulder field. The platform is already elevated, she said. If the approach was controlled to a single line and the staircase was removable. It's a ladder, not a staircase, I said. If the ladder was removable, she said, then constant presence at this elevation becomes a management problem rather than a structural failure. You're 6 feet off the terrain. They don't climb with purpose. You could pull the ladder and be functionally unreachable by ground-level approach. I looked at the platform, at the 6-foot clearance beneath it. I had designed the elevation for thermal management and flood drainage, not as a defensive feature. But the defensive application was real, and Petra's law enforcement background had identified it in roughly 30 seconds, in a way that 2 weeks of occupation hadn't produced in me. We need to extend the platform, I said. It's currently 12 by 8. The walls are on the terrace floor. If we relocate the wall structure to the platform level and extend the deck to cover the full terrace footprint. That's a major rebuild, Joel said. That's the right rebuild, I said. We started the next morning. What followed was 8 days of the most technically demanding work I had done on the build, not because the individual operations were more complex than the original construction, but because we were modifying a structure that was already load-bearing, which meant we were working within constraints that didn't exist during ground-up construction. You can't remove a primary beam without transferring its load before the cut. You can't extend a platform deck without verifying that the anchor trees can absorb the additional moment arm. Every decision had a downstream consequence that had to be modeled before the first cut. Jeff turned out to be invaluable for this phase in a way I hadn't predicted. He had no construction skills whatsoever and made no pretense of having any. What he had was the habit of thinking in systems, the ecology training that made him instinctively model how changes in one element affected the whole. He sat at the edge of the work area and talked through the load paths with me in the language of energy transfer. And the conversation produced solutions I wouldn't have reached alone. It is a particular pleasure, even in extremity, to think alongside a mind that processes problems differently than yours does. I'm aware of how strange it sounds to describe pleasure in that context. I'm describing it anyway because it was real. The rebuild finished on day 25. The extended platform covered the full terrace width 38 feet of deck at 6-foot elevation, with the wall structure relocated to platform level and the roof pitch rebuilt on the new framing. The ladder was a single 10-foot section, unpinned from its base mounting in under 30 seconds, removable and storable on the platform itself. The approach to the platform was funneled by the boulder field on the east, and the rock face on the north into a single 12-foot wide corridor, controllable, visible, defensible, without requiring anything beyond the elevation differential itself. Petra walked the approach 3 times after the rebuild completed, timing herself, reading the geometry. "This is good," she said, which from Petra was equivalent to anyone else saying it was exceptional. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the specific exhaustion of a project completed at the edge of your actual capability. The kind of exhaustion that sits in the joints rather than the muscles. I sat on the platform edge with my feet hanging over the south face and looked at the forest below and tried to assess whether what I felt was anything close to satisfaction. It wasn't quite. Satisfaction requires a context in which the thing completed is enough. This wasn't enough. It was right. It was well made. It was the best I could build with what I had. But it was sitting above a forest that was filling from below with something that did not tire or recalculate. And it was housing 4 people whose food margin ran to approximately 12 more days without resupply. And the cold at this elevation was going to begin making every task measurably harder starting in the next 2 weeks. Enough was not the right word. Viable was closer. We had built something viable. That evening, Joel asked if he could see the topographic map. I gave it to him. He studied it for a long time, tracing routes with his finger, checking the legend, doing the kind of quiet calculation that he did, with his eyes fixed on a middle distance rather than the page. When he looked up, he had the expression he used when he'd reached a conclusion he knew I wouldn't immediately agree with. "The northern connector," he said. "The fire road." Petra said it connects to Highway 395 at the north end of the basin. 395 runs north-south through the valley on the eastern side of the Sierra. He paused. If 395 is passable even partially, that's a corridor. That's a route to Reno. I looked at him. "Joel." "I know," he said. "I'm not saying now. I'm saying eventually." "What's in Reno?" He was quiet for a moment. "My sister, maybe." The word maybe carried everything it needed to carry. He wasn't asking me to validate a rescue mission. He was asking me to acknowledge that his reason for eventual descent existed, that it was legitimate, and that the plan we were building toward had to account for a direction north, toward 395, toward the possibility of a sister rather than being a permanent installation at this elevation. "Okay," I said. "We plan for that." "How long?" "We need winter to pass. We need the situation below to stabilize in whatever form it stabilizes. Spring, realistically." He nodded. He folded the map carefully and gave it back to me. We didn't discuss it again that night, but the conversation had changed the shape of our planning in a way that was necessary and irreversible, and I was glad he'd raised it rather than carrying it alone. On day 29, Petra made a decision that cost us something permanent. She had been on the platform doing a standard observation sweep, something she'd established as a daily practice, a 30-minute documented survey of visible movement in the forest below when she spotted a child. She came down from the platform without her usual economy of movement. And when I looked at her face, I saw something I hadn't seen in 3 weeks of close proximity. She was unsettled. Not afraid, unsettled. "There's a child in the tree line," she said, moving east along the 6900 contour, moving deliberately, not infected. I was up the ladder and on the platform in seconds. Joel and Jeff followed. The child was visible at the edge of the upper canopy, small, moving with a caution that was unmistakably human in its deliberateness, pausing at each gap in the cover to observe before moving. The distance was roughly 300 meters. I couldn't determine age precisely. 8 to 12 was my estimate. "Alone?" I asked. "I've been watching for 15 minutes, Petra said. "Alone." We all understood what this was. We had been 4 people for 15 days, and the cabin's resources were calibrated to 4 people across a specific timeline. 4 people extended to 5 changed the arithmetic in ways that mattered. It also changed something else: the emotional architecture of the group, the implicit agreement that we were managing survivability rather than conducting a humanitarian operation. The child was 300 meters downslope, below the primary movement band by approximately 200 feet, but not by enough. Jeff was the one who said it, in the flat, even voice he used when he was stating a conclusion rather than making an argument. "We have to get her." Nobody disagreed. That was the thing: nobody's face, nobody's silence, held the shape of an objection. Not even mine, and I was the one who had been running the resource calculation. There was something in the fact of a child moving alone through that forest that simply overrode the arithmetic, not irrationally, but with a specific moral logic that I recognized in real time as the correct logic, the one that the cabin's purpose had been building toward without my knowing it. Petra and I went down. Joel stayed on the platform with the ladder pulled up. Jeff stayed with Joel. The descent to the 6900 contour took 22 minutes. The movement in the forest around us was audible at the lower edge. The same irregular percussion and exhalation cycle we'd encountered on the first day. Not close, but not distant either. And Petra moved with a speed and directness that suggested she had calculated the margin before we left the platform, and found it acceptable, if not comfortable. The child's name was Nadia. She was 9 years old. She'd been separated from a group of survivors, 8 adults and 3 other children, when the group had been forced to scatter at a creek crossing at the basin perimeter on day 4 of the outbreak. She had been moving upslope alone for 25 days. 25 days. She was not in shock. She was hungry, dehydrated, and carrying a severity of experience in her face that 9-year-old faces are not built to carry. But she was functionally present, oriented. And when Petra told her we had a cabin above the tree line, she looked up the slope with an expression that I found harder to look at than almost anything else. In those weeks, the expression of a child who has decided not to hope, in case the hope is wrong, and then can't prevent the hope anyway. "Can you climb?" Petra asked. Nadia looked at the slope. "Yes," she said. She could. We went up. 5 people changed the cabin in ways I hadn't predicted and couldn't have. Nadia was not a resource unit. She was a 9-year-old who had spent 25 days alone in a forest and had developed, in response to that experience, a set of adaptations that were remarkable in their specificity. She did not require continuous reassurance. She required consistency, the same spatial arrangement each morning, the same sequence of tasks, the same faces in the same positions when she woke up. She calibrated very quickly to the cabin's rhythms and inserted herself into them with a purposeful precision that I recognized as a coping mechanism, and decided not to analyze too deeply because it was working. She took over Jeff's garden bed entirely on her 3rd day with his cheerful consent, and managed it with an attention to detail that surpassed his original planting work. She checked the soil moisture twice daily, adjusted the leaf cover against frost with a consistent monitoring routine, and kept a small handwritten log of her observations in the margin of one of the blank pages in Daria's notepad, writing carefully around the existing entries, as though she understood that the previous writing was something to be respected. On her 5th day with us, she found the signal mirror in the dry bag and asked what it was. I showed her how it worked, the geometry of reflected signal, the way you align the flash using your own shadow as a sight, the pattern of 3 short bursts that constitutes a standard distress signal. She practiced it for 20 minutes, using the sun and a rock face as a target, with the focused intensity of a child learning something she decided was important. "Are we signaling?" she asked. "If we see an aircraft," I said. "Yes." "How often do aircraft come?" I looked at the sky, which had been empty since our arrival. "I don't know," I said. She nodded and put the mirror away carefully in the dry bag and went back to her garden notes. She had asked the question to calibrate her expectations, not to express need. And when the honest answer was uncertain, she accepted it and moved on. I found this quality in her more steadying than I could adequately explain. Adults, under pressure, tend toward the need for certainty, even when certainty is unavailable. Nadia had apparently concluded, in her 25 days alone, the calibration to actual information was more survivable than the comfort of false certainty. That was a lesson she had paid a very high price for, and she carried it without complaint. On day 31, we ate the first harvest from the garden, a modest collection of small kale leaves and a few radishes barely thumb-sized, prepared in boiling water over the fire. The portion per person was approximately 1/4 of a meaningful meal contribution. Jeff presented it with a solemnity that was partly theatrical and mostly genuine, and Nadia ate hers with the careful attention she brought to everything she decided was important. "It'll be bigger next harvest," she told us. "I've been thinning the weaker plants so the stronger ones have more room." Jeff looked at her across the fire with an expression I recognized as a teacher's pride, the specific pleasure of watching a student exceed the lesson. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." The first snow came on day 38. I had been watching for it, monitoring the cloud formation over the ridge each morning, reading the air temperature at the same locations with the same level of attention I'd given trail conditions before all of this. The snow arrived as forecast by every physical indicator. A wet coastal system pushing over the Sierra. Light initial accumulation, sustained. The roof held. The gap chinking I'd redone twice before the weather turned held. The fire circle inside the cabin, a simple contained rock arrangement in the center of the platform floor with a smoke gap at the roof peak, managed the interior temperature to a level that required extra layers, but did not require continuous fire management. We were inside for most of the first 2 days. Joel's knee had fully recovered by this point, which was something the confinement would have been harder for him if the knee had remained a limitation. Jeff kept a teaching schedule, informally, which had emerged over the previous 2 weeks as a natural extension of his conversational habits. Daily discussions about the ecological dynamics of the basin, the fire ecology of the Sierra, the chemistry of soil systems, illustrated with whatever materials were at hand. Nadia attended these sessions with visible engagement. Petra attended with visible skepticism that gradually modulated into interested neutrality as the sessions progressed. On the second day of the snow, I went to the platform edge and looked down at the forest. The snow had done something unexpected. It had made the movement visible. Against the white ground cover, the irregular trail of compressed and disturbed snow that indicated infected movement through the upper tree line was readable at a distance in a way the summer forest floor had never allowed. I could see the dispersal pattern with a clarity I hadn't had before. 3 distinct movement corridors, following the terrain easements I'd predicted, 2 of them curving away from the direct approach to the terrace. The third running more directly uphill and stopping at approximately 7,100 feet, where the gradient increased to the point that the directionless drift of the infected appeared unable to overcome it. The gradient was still working. Not perfectly, not permanently, but working. I stayed at the platform edge for a long time, watching the movement trails in the snow, reading the pattern, doing the calculation I'd been running since day 1. The situation below was not improving in the sense of resolving. The movement was still present, still active, but it was stabilizing in density. The lower basin had been processed to the point where the dispersal upslope was driven by crowding rather than by an active source, which meant the upward pressure would eventually be governed by the natural attrition of the infected over time. Weeks, months, but with a direction. That was the first day I thought about spring, not as an abstraction, but as an actual destination. I went back inside and told the others what I'd seen. Petra asked questions, verified my interpretation of the movement trails, and agreed with the assessment. Joel said nothing, but his expression contained something that had been absent for a long time, not certainty, but the beginnings of a legitimate basis for planning. That night, Nadia asked if she could read the rest of Daria's notes. I thought about it. The last entries were not appropriate for a 9-year-old, in the way a fair weather consideration might suggest, but Nadia was not a 9-year-old in fair weather terms, and the sanitized version of everything she'd already survived seemed more dishonest than protective. "Some of the last pages are hard to read," I said. "I know," she said. "I want to read them anyway." I gave her the notepad. She read the last 3 pages quietly, in her corner of the platform, and when she finished, she closed it carefully and put it back in the dry bag and didn't ask any questions. In the morning, she went directly to the garden and spent an extra hour there, working with the same focused attention as always. I didn't ask her what she'd felt. She'd told me what she needed to tell me by putting the notes away carefully, by treating Daria's last words with the same respect she'd shown them from the first day she'd written in the margins around them. Spring came in the way Sierra Springs come, not all at once, but in installments, each warmth advance followed by a late cold withdrawal, the snowpack retreating in stages up the slope until the terrace was clear and the upper tree line was visible again without the movement revealing white ground. The garden had survived the winter in sections. Nadia had adapted it through the cold months with an improvised cold frame cover, a tarp and stick construction she'd built herself, without asking for help, which I discovered one morning when I came to the platform edge and found it there already completed. The kale had overwintered in a form that was technically kale. The radishes had frozen. She'd replanted the radish bed from seed she'd saved herself, a practice Jeff had taught her in passing in week 3 that she'd taken more seriously than any of us had known. The movement trails in the lower forest were sparse by late February. By March, they were infrequent enough that observation sweeps were registering single figures rather than the continuous diffuse presence of the first months. The attrition had been doing the work of time, and time had been doing its work. Petra had spent the winter mapping. The topographic map, supplemented by her own surveying notes from daily observation sweeps, had grown into a detailed picture of the basin's current state, which corridors were clear, which were still active, which approaches to the fire road were navigable with acceptable margin. She had done this work with the same systematic documentation she brought to everything, building it into a functional intelligence picture without framing it as anything other than task management. On a clear morning in late March, she laid the annotated map on the platform floor, and the 5 of us gathered around it. "The northern fire road is accessible," she said. "The approach from this position to the roadhead is 2 miles of ridgeline in cover. The road itself, based on what I can see of the northern section from the high observation point above the boulder field, is clear of both vehicle obstruction and active presence for the first mile. After that, my visibility runs out." "Highway 395, Joel said. "Approximately 4 miles from the road, head to the junction, based on the topo. I can't tell you what 395 looks like." "Nobody can," Joel said. "That's the point." Jeff looked at the map and then at Nadia, who was sitting cross-legged on the platform edge, listening with her chin on her hands. "What do you think?" he asked her. She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all questions. "I think we should go," she said. "I think the cabin is why we can go." She paused. "But I think we should come back." Nobody answered that immediately. It was the kind of statement that lands and takes a moment to fully resolve in the listener, because it isn't a request and it isn't a plan. It's a value, an orientation, a description of what the thing we'd built actually meant. We weren't abandoning the cabin. We were leaving from it. Those were different things. The departure date we set was 2 weeks out, which gave us time to cache the cabin with enough material to function as a legitimate re-entry point: sealed food, secured tools, Jeff's garden in a state that would survive another absence, the platform in full defensive configuration, with a ladder stowed at the top. Petra drafted a short supply record in the remaining blank pages of the notepad, including our route, our destination estimate, and the date we'd left. She put the notepad back in the dry bag and returned it to the crack in the rock face. I asked her why she'd written in the same format as Daria's notes. She looked at the crack for a moment. "Because if someone comes here after us," she said, "I want them to have what we had when we found it." We left on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week I'd first smelled the valley from the trail, a detail I noticed only later and have never decided whether to find meaningful. The cabin was sealed, stocked, and standing. The descent to the fire road took 3 hours, 395 was not what any of us had hoped for, and not the worst of what any of us had feared. What it was is another story, and I'm not yet ready to tell it cleanly. What I am ready to tell is this. The cabin held. We went back to it twice in the following year, and both times it held roof intact, garden gone but recoverable, the notepad dry in its crack in the rock face where Daria Osei left the first word and Petra left the second, and Nadia wrote a single line in the margin of the last page that I read both times I returned and cannot reproduce here without losing something in the translation. I built that cabin because the smell told me to go up, and going up required something to go up toward. I built it because Joel processed timber without complaint on a bad knee and didn't ask me to explain the physics of a joint I was working out in real time. I built it because Petra looked at the geometry and saw the defensive feature I'd missed, because Jeff carried seeds in his coat pocket to a disaster, because he was a biology teacher and seeds seemed like the right category, because Nadia managed the margin of hope with more precision than any of us. I didn't build it for all of them. I built it before I knew them. But it held because of all of them. That's the part nobody expects, not the structure. The reason the structure was worth the wait. I still know every joint in that build. I can close my eyes and trace every beam, every peg, every imperfect mortise. I recut twice until it held. That knowledge lives in my hands, the way real knowledge lives, not in memory, but in the body, in the place where work gets stored and stays long after everything else goes quiet. I go back when I can. The terrace is still there. The east firs are still standing. The ladder pulls up in under 30 seconds, clean as the first day I built it to do that. I don't know why that still matters to me. It just does.